They say all is fair in love and war, but all is not fair. Why do the good die young? Why does evil prosper? In this series, love and war find their beginning.
You knock these buildings down, we'll hear all of us.
Birds literally dropped from the sky.
But scientists warn the worst is yet to come.
Only by knowing their past do we get clues as to how the story ends.
Every night on the TV news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation.
This is only the beginning.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. How quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
The sun was setting on the old world, and it was time for something new. And the good news was hope was rising in the West. This new world full of opportunities and possibilities, but more than anything, it was full of the promise of a better life. A life where someone could follow the dictates of their own conscience. And around this time, the King of England, he's speaking of those who prized conscience over anything else, and he's quoted as saying, "Conform or harry them out of the land, or else worse." So you can see religious freedom was dead. And the New World was a land with no pope and no king. And so just as America is rising, the Old World was in the midst of revolution in the heart of where the Inquisition had been the strongest, France. So the year is 1798. The Pope has been taken captive. The wealth gap has reached a climax between the haves and the have-nots. That's what often happens in revolution. Once people have nothing left to lose, they lose it. And you can hear the rumblings of this even today. But this was no random moment. This was the period of time long foretold as 1,260 years of reign for the old world, and now Rome's rule was done. So as the old world was falling, the new was rising. But sometimes it's easier to take someone out of Babylon than to take Babylon out of someone. And as those men and women boarded the boats headed for the new world, they were longing for freedom. But as soon as they arrived, sadly, they drove out the natives by violence and started to practice force. And somehow, we all often resort to force with others when they don't act like we think they should. And we've got to admit that this is not right. So as those men and women, those boys and girls, were boarding ships in Holland to sail to the shores of the New World, they listened to a man named John Robinson who told them that the Reformation, this protest against the mingling of church and state, the protest of trampling on conscience, must continue and must not stall. He said if the great men who had raised up the torch were still around, they would keep looking for more light. And so he challenged them and us to never become satisfied with thinking, you know enough, I know enough, we know enough. Just to keep digging, to keep the spirit of curiosity alive. Robinson is quoted as saying, "Remember your promise and covenant with providence, to receive whatever light and truth shall be made known to you from his written word." Then he says, "For it is not possible the Christian world should so come lately out of anti-Christian darkness, and that full perfection of knowledge should break forth at once." These people were unafraid to risk everything to escape the old world and kiss the shores of the new. And as they were boarding that ship, those ships, Robinson said to them, "I am very confident the Lord has more truth and light yet to break forth out of his holy word." So they sailed to the shores of America. And then sadly, somehow, not long after they arrived, many began to mandate that only church members can serve in government, and then it was not long before persecution arose in the New World. But the good news was hope had not completely disappeared. There's another reformer who rises up, Roger Williams. But even when Williams arrives in America, he found the church mandating people attend or they would be breaking the law. Williams was respected and loved by so many people. He was this faithful leader and minister, a man of rare gifts, integrity, kindness. He showed these to everyone he met. But as he kept teaching and preaching tolerance and freedom of speech and freedom of conscience, he was accused of subverting the government and society. And then he was sentenced for a crime as an enemy of the state. So to escape arrest, he was forced to flee in the cold, stormy winds of winter into the deep forest. And he wrote later, "For 14 weeks I was sorely tossed in a bitter season, not knowing what bread or bed did mean. But the ravens fed me in the wilderness, and a hollow tree served as a shelter." And he continues through the snow and this deep forest until he finds refuge with an Indian tribe whose confidence and affection he wins while teaching them the truths of Jinnah. And so finally, he made it to the shores of Narragansett Bay, where he laid the foundation for the first state in the New World that would recognize the essence of true freedom, that every man and every woman should have the liberty to worship according to the light of their own conscience. And he establishes civil government on the doctrine of the liberty of conscience and the equality of opinions before the law. That state he founded would later become known as Rhode Island, and it became the asylum for civil and religious liberty, these two cornerstones of the American Republic. And then you have the Declaration of Independence, which says all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Is that still true today? You know, the Constitution guarantees, in the most explicit terms, the inviolability of conscience, and that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And then there's that key, perhaps most important line in it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. All right, so all this is going on. Word gets out in the old world, and thousands and tens of thousands begin to risk their lives to escape to the new world. You know, most nations in history arose in turmoil. They must conquer or be conquered, and one by one we see empires rise and fall. But America has somewhat of a different story. John, way back there on the island of Patmos, saw America's rise, and he wrote that it would come up from the earth, and he describes it unlike all the ferocious beasts in the prophecies before it, like the lion, the bear, the leopard, the dragon. So instead of this monster, John describes this new empire like an innocent lamb, the very symbol of Yeshua. And then some describe it like a silent seed planted in the earth. We grew into an empire. And the lamb in John's vision is described as having two horns, two symbols of its power: separation of church and state. A church without a pope and a state without a king. A republic self-governed by its own citizens. But then John sees something absolutely strange start to happen. This scene changes, and he describes the Lamb beginning to speak like a dragon, the very symbol of Lucifer. So you can imagine that total switch that takes place. So not all is roses in the New World. Already the Puritan faith in the colonies seems to be turning into the persecution of the Dark Ages, and many once again lose hope of anything good in the future. And then there's this war in 1812, and one man, a patriot, in the army, He wants nothing to do with religion. He sees how awful it became and how awful it is becoming even in the New World, and he is detested by it. His name is William Miller. He begins almost for sport to mock the Christian religion because it had all these erroneous teachings, burning hellfire for bad people, that God tortures people for all eternity. Miller starts to mock the idea of this secret rapture, not a visible second coming. He denounces the idea that the dead moved on into the next life, and that didn't make sense with other things in Scripture, and that prophecy, was it sealed? Was everything in Scripture a mystery? He saw no evidence that the millennium was to be on the earth instead of in heaven. And then there was this teaching that Miller mocked, this idea that he said, this has no basis in Scripture, that Israel was the country to look for in prophecy rather than the United States. Miller saw none of these things making sense or having any validity, but there was one that intrigued him the most of all of these. It was this idea that caused him to dig deep. This man who hated religion ventured to show how ridiculous the Bible was and how much it contradicted itself. He was so curious why scholars had pronounced a curse on the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel foretelling this promised deliverer. So he keeps studying, and he kept making more sense rather than less of the words he was reading. So finally, around the age of 34, he became convicted that the war between good and evil was soon to be coming to an end, this one that had started long ago in Jannah, and that there was this prophecy of 2,300 years that would end in the year 1844, and that a moment of judgment would take place just before the return of Yeshua. Miller was a wealthy farmer, and he was so convicted that what he was studying was true that he sold everything and he went on the road teaching anyone who would listen to what he had learned. And as the message of the end of this cosmic war was ramping up, all around America, a power from beneath was working to bring about the last great scenes in the drama. A power hoping to rip the nation in two, to divide and conquer. And at this time, guess who rejected Miller's teachings that the end of the war was soon the most? The Christians. Most of these Christians still had this old world mentality deep-rooted in the fibers of their being, and many wanted to follow what they knew to be right, but they trusted their pastors, their priests, who were forbidding them and others from going to listen to any proposed new light. You think about that charge from the old world, never stop digging. And at this moment, they described it as this great awakening in America and around the world. Many could not endure the persecution that they would experience from their family and fellow church members, and so they remained in ignorance in hopes to keep the peace. But Yeshua had said long before, I didn't come to bring peace, but instead I came to make people decide which side of the war they were on. And so one of those who began to listen to Miller and the things he would say, she would later write, he who deliberately stifles his convictions of duty because it interferes with his inclinations will finally lose the power to distinguish between truth and error. And then it was Thomas Guthrie, this Presbyterian minister, who began to write on the separation of the Protestant churches, and he said, 300 years ago, our church, with an open Bible on her banner and this motto, search the Scriptures, they marched out from the gates of Rome, but did they come clean out of Babylon? And then it was Charles Spurgeon. He said, the Church of England seems to be eaten through and through with sacramentarianism, and those of whom we thought better things are turning aside one by one from the fundamentals of the faith. Then he said, I believe the very heart of England is honeycombed with the damnable infidelity which dares still go into the pulpit and call itself Christian. All these people had lost sight of that glorious concept of truth, that truth is always progressive, and that truth is always personal, and that truth does not dictate another man's conscience. When the church loses its power, it turns to those in power, and when the church seizes this kind of power, it turns to force. And when the church loses its supposed power from God, it turns to the power of men, and that's how a war would break out on American soil.